Good evening everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Strategies for Building Resilience and Reducing Anxiety in Students with Learning Disabilities. This webinar is presented by Learning Without Limits in partnership with NDCO, Sutherland Dyslexia Support Group and Southern Sydney BEN. Our guest speaker tonight is Lizette Campbell. Lizette is the Principal Psychologist of Lizette Campbell and Associates. She's a member of the College of Educational and Developmental Psychologists and a member of the College of Clinical Psychologists. She has worked throughout New South Wales and London in educational, child development and child health settings. She's been in private practice for over 25 years. She has considerable expertise and a special interest in gifted students and learning and developmental difficulties, including autism spectrum disorders and ADHD. Lizette conducts comprehensive diagnostic assessments and provides counselling and therapy for children and their families. Before I hand you over to Lizette, just a little bit of housekeeping information. We are recording this webinar, so if anything goes wrong or you have to leave or you're having technical difficulties, please remember we will send a link to this session for you in a few days. You can hear us if you have your speakers on, but we can't hear you. So feel free to ask questions by using the chat option in the bottom right corner. You can ask questions and make comments, and that will keep you engaged and involved during the session. Lizette has told us that she's happy to take questions during the presentation, but because there's been such an interest in this webinar and there are so many of you participating today, we might not be able to get to all of the questions. And if time permits, Lizette would be happy to stay on and answer any of your questions at the end of the session. An email went out with the instructions on how to access this webinar and test your system, and there was some troubleshooting tips on there too. So if you are having any problems, we will try and answer them. Just pop them in the chat area and we'll try to do our best to answer them, but if not, we will be sending out a link to this webinar in a few days. I will now hand you over to Lizette Campbell. Enjoy the session.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good evening, everybody. It's fantastic to see so many people have logged on. It's really, really great. Let me just see if I'm seated correctly. Hopefully you can all hear me. So tonight I'd like to try and cover a number of topics. I'll define resilience and learning disabilities. We'll talk about assessment and the importance of considering a number of diagnoses and the possibility of perhaps more than one diagnosis being at play. We'll talk about how learning disabilities are classified and the main professional system used, which is DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th edition. We'll talk about accommodations and what used to be called special provisions and is now called disability provisions, and ways of supporting students, thus reducing the anxiety related to their learning disability. So, what is resilience? Resilience is the capacity to withstand stress and catastrophe. It's sometimes described as the ability to bounce back from a disaster, or the ability to keep going when it seems that things are almost too much to bear or too difficult for too long. Being resilient doesn't mean going through life without experiencing stress or pain or without getting upset. People develop greater resilience by working through their emotions and the effects of stress and painful events. In children, it's learning and adapting and understanding that helps create resilience, as well as realistic praise and encouragement. Resilience is not something that you're born with or born without. Resilience develops as people grow up and they gain better thinking and self-management skills and more knowledge. Resilience also comes from supportive relationships with parents, peers and others, as well as cultural beliefs and traditions that help people cope with the inevitable bumps in life. So, resilience is found in a variety of behaviours and thoughts and actions that can be learnt and developed across the lifespan. It can change and evolve and wax and wane. It's not fixed. It's not a particular capacity that you have. It's something that we as parents and educators can enhance and nurture. So I just want to stress that this presentation is not how to deal with anxiety, but rather how to provide a student with an environment and the tools to better manage and deal with what are very realistic anxieties and worries related to their learning disabilities. So students with a learning disability are vulnerable to stress and frustration and confusion in academic situations. They may feel helpless to change things and develop negative self-talk and avoidance and undesirable coping behaviours. I sometimes refer to this as a tape in your head when I'm talking to a student. And having a parent advocate and supportive teachers at school, as well as greater self-knowledge, will help reduce anxiety and increase resilience. I wonder perhaps if we could say to some people to mute their speakers at home. We're getting a bit of feedback coming through. Thank you. So this schematic is something that I drew up a couple of years ago. If we're thinking about the tape in your head, the situation I drew this up for here was a student who was described as gifted with a learning disability. So we could take an example that perhaps they may have missed a deadline or ran out of time, and they would be having automatic thoughts going, I'm useless, I'm hopeless, I've done it again, I'm going to be in trouble, I've let the rest of my classmates down or my group down. Maybe they've had a number of situations where they've felt their academic success was never good enough, that their school reports say should try harder or could do better. Maybe they've been troubled with procrastination and don't know how to get out of that spiral and don't understand that it's part of their learning disability and their organisational challenges. They might perhaps develop some of their own conditional beliefs and think, if I can't get it right, I'm a failure, and develop some black and white thinking. And perhaps they might not ask for help because they don't want to let on that they're struggling with this. But all in all, underneath it, they're developing a core belief that says, I'm not really smart, I'm not gifted, I'm not good enough, and everyone's judging me negatively. So what we need to do is step in before this tape becomes on a permanent loop or kicks in very quickly. So an assessment, a comprehensive assessment, will give you and your child or your student a lot of understanding and a lot of knowledge about themselves. It needs to be done, not just a simple checklist, needs to be done by somebody who has well-recognised credentials so that when you go to the school or you apply for some assistance with an exam or something, there won't be any question about the depth and breadth of the report. You may need to develop an understanding of disability legislation and the standards for education to be able to advocate for your child. At the end of this presentation, there'll be a PDF with some resources and some links, and I think this is going to come out to you as well, and those standards will be on that link too. So tonight, what I'm talking about when I'm talking about learning disabilities is quite a broad group. It may cover a medical disability, physical disability, an intellectual disability, an executive function disability such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Currently, the system that we use, DSM-5, now refers to a specific learning disorder. We have previously had a specific learning disability, and some people talk about a learning difficulty. These terms are sometimes used interchangeably, but they're not always the same. And we do need to be careful if we're looking at information and research from other countries. For example, in England and the UK, a learning difficulty tends to be the term used for an intellectual disability, and that is not the case here in Australia. Autism spectrum disorder is another learning disability we're referring to tonight, and emotional and mental health issues as well. So just to give you a bit of an idea, if we're looking to make a diagnosis of a specific learning disorder using DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, there's actually quite complex and clear criteria that we have to investigate and be able to provide evidence of. So the child would have to have difficulties learning and using academic skills. And there's a range of possible symptoms that have to have persisted for at least 6 months, despite the provision of interventions that target those difficulties. This is a new requirement, and so we no longer would make a diagnosis of a specific learning disorder before a child had had a reasonable exposure to school and to best practice type interventions. We may see indicators of a learning disability, and there may very well be family history and genetic markers, but we would need, using the current classification, to have had the opportunity to provide targeted intervention before we would make that diagnosis. So it may be showing as difficulties perhaps with number sense, difficulties learning number facts, difficulties with accurate calculation. The child has difficulty working out that a certain number is bigger or smaller than another number, that if you are doing a subtraction, your answer should be smaller rather than larger than any of the numbers. They may have difficulty with mathematical reasoning. We also now would look very carefully at the impact on daily living. We would look to make sure that the learning difficulties are not better accounted for by a visual problem or ESL or a language disorder. ESL being English as a second language. We now specify a learning disorder. So you might be told that your child has a specific learning disorder with an impairment in written expression. And that would mean that the child had difficulty with spelling accuracy. They may perhaps be able to learn spelling lists quite well, but when they do their own free writing, they make up very idiosyncratic words. Even if they've been in their spelling list, they can't remember how to use them. They muddle up homonyms and synonyms, and their grammar is surprisingly poor when their spoken language is quite appropriate. The clarity and the organisational structure of their written work is not what you'd expect. They appear to sort of think that you've got ESP and can fill in the blanks, or they don't realise when they're reading their own work that they've missed out an explanation or a reason. So we would usually make a qualifier or a specifier, so that the child has an impairment in reading or an impairment in written expression or an impairment in mathematics. And you can see up here that dyslexia is an acceptable term, but if you use the term dyslexia, you have to also be very clear whether or not there's a reading comprehension problem and whether or not there's a maths reasoning problem, because they don't always go together. And using these classifications, dyslexia really means problems with accurate or fluent word recognition, poor decoding and poor spelling abilities. It does not imply reading comprehension difficulties. So you can see there's quite a lot in making this diagnosis. and it's important that somebody makes it carefully. In my practice, I do unfortunately hear a lot of stories about people who've been told, oh no, your child's not dyslexic, or oh yes, your child's dyslexic, by somebody who has not really undertaken any thorough assessment and simply has a view that dyslexia means reversing letters or numbers, or unless you reverse letter or numbers, you can't be dyslexic. So it's unfortunate. Okay, we also have to specify the level of impairment, whether it's mild, moderate or severe. And so a mild impairment would be some difficulties learning skills in one or two academic domains, so perhaps reading and or maths alone, but of a mild enough severity that the child is able to compensate or function well when they're provided with appropriate accommodations or support services. Now, that doesn't mean that they can function without that. They need to be provided with them. So at all levels, they need to be provided with some level of support, accommodations and adjustments. It's really important that you look to see if there's something else going on, particularly if once you've started some intervention, once you've started working with somebody or changing how you approach things, or ease off on certain things you've been doing before and things aren't improving, you need to see what is going on, what are the problems, where are the problems occurring. You need to think very much about whether there's a dual diagnosis, whether perhaps there's two things happening. For example, dyslexia and ADHD very commonly co-occur, and one can mask the other. One of the things you look at is response to intervention. How have they managed with some well-designed intervention? Have they progressed at a faster rate? If they've had 4 months of a very well-designed reading program, have they made 8 months of progress, or have they made 4 months worth of progress? Thinking about the fact that a learning disability means the child at that time is unable to do certain things or reproduce certain things or recognise certain things. Whereas with ADHD, a child has the ability but may not have the ability to always demonstrate that skill. They may get distracted, they may find it difficult to sustain their efforts and attention if the tasks seem simple or repetitive. So it's not a skill deficit, it's a deficit in being able to produce the skill consistently and readily and easily, whereas a learning disability is a skill deficit. You definitely need to treat all of the issues that are going on, and that does tend to be something that we find a lot, that there is a second diagnosis that needs to be addressed in order to make all the intervention that you're doing with your speech therapist, your tutor, your reading support team have an appropriate effect. You also need to think about what else might be going on. Is there clinical anxiety? Is there bereavement or grief happening? Is there bullying in the playground, or something else that is causing a child to have difficulty learning and listening, and perhaps frightened to ask questions or take a risk? So in terms of strategies to support and foster resilience, the first step is comprehensive assessment and good recommendations. The second step is evidence-based and empirically evaluated intervention. Now, it's really important. There are a lot of programs out there that are appealing and attractive and seem to be scientifically based, cost a huge amount of money and a huge amount of time. They need to be evidence-based and evaluated by a range of means, not just the institution that's organising them, or not just sort of one-off case studies of people who give fantastic testimonials. Your child may need some top-up tutoring as well as the intervention or treatment or therapy, and their needs will change over time. So you need to remember that, and I'll come to that again in a minute. So the third step involves a lot of things that I want to go through with you tonight. It's really important that you educate yourself and your child about their learning disability or their learning disabilities, that you understand how to both rebut people's mistaken comments. I mean, things like, you can't be dyslexic if you don't reverse your numbers, or if your child can concentrate on the computer, then they're not having any attentional problems. You also need to know when to let things slide, as well as how to advocate for your child. I'd really recommend that you join a Learning Disabilities Association, Learning Difficulties Coalition, a range of different things. There's Gifted Learning Disabled Australia, specific purpose support groups. They will be a wealth of knowledge. You will find people in similar situations, and you'll also be able to attend lots of seminars and workshops. It's very worthwhile. Recommend too that you create and maintain a portfolio for your child and an information file. It's really helpful to provide a clear summary to all new teachers. It should only need to be about a page, and you'll need to do it again the next year, and the next, and the next. And that's really important to remember. You need to work with a professional that you can communicate with and who can case manage if need be. It may not need to be very often, it may just be occasional. This is usually or often a developmental paediatrician or an ed and dev psychologist. You need to gather a support team, be able to use them and access them when you need them. And you also need to remember to take care of yourself, because it is a lot of work. And you may also find that it's bringing up some issues for when you were at school, or someone in your family was at school. Some of the worries and fears or frustrations that you had if you also had difficulties with maths or spelling or reading or attentional difficulties. It's helpful if you share personal stories of success and disappointment, or family stories. It doesn't have to be limited to academics, but it's really important that children realise that there is a broader perspective of success and failure through life. They often look up to their parents and see parents and teachers as being very capable of doing everything, and think that that's what they should be able to do too. It's important that you recognise that the picture is going to change with age and with circumstances, and that includes even if you think you've got things working pretty well, you may suddenly find that a move to a different school or into a different, more demanding academic band will suddenly bring up a whole lot of issues that you hadn't expected or hadn't thought about. So many students who have an early diagnosis of dyslexia and who are well supported and have had really good effective interventions won't have an obvious learning difficulties by their mid-teens, but there really will be a residual effect of fatigue, possibly avoidance of reading, and there may be discrepancies between their oral output and their written work. ADHD, if treated well, is also not particularly obvious, unless perhaps you take a medication holiday or there's a sudden change in health or growth. the demands of the academic curriculum change, or perhaps puberty or an emotional crisis. Maths is a bit harder to say because it's not always identified early, and sometimes it's just regarded as, oh, you're not very good at maths, and a lot of maths difficulties are not identified. Similarly with disorder of written expression. It's really important that you acknowledge how hard some things are, that you realise and that you reiterate to your child that things are pretty hard now and they're going to need some extra work and maybe some tutoring or speech therapy, but it will pay off and they will become more and more fluent, more and more independent in their homework, more confident, and give them some kind of time frame, such as over the next 2 terms or over the next 4 terms or by year 4 or by next year. It's also worth thinking about. Some families consider working towards a reward or a reinforcer with the acknowledgement that, you are doing extra work, you are doing 2 afternoons a week of extra homework, or you're missing out on some of the playtime, and so some families may work towards an incentive for doing that. This little graph that you can see here is one that's also quite handy sometimes to talk about with your child at any age or stage. This is from the book Overcoming Dyslexia by Sally Shaywitz. It's a very, very worthwhile book to get hold of. So what it's showing here, I'm sorry, it is a little faint, is if you look at the time spent reading each day, if you read less than a minute a day, which is basically you're not reading, you will still, over a year, encounter 8,000 words. Now, your score on something like a reading test will be below the 10th percentile. You won't do very well if you're not reading very much. If you read between 4 and 6 minutes a day, you'll be exposed to more than 280,000 words a year. You'll be scoring the 50th percentile on reading scores. If you read for 20 minutes every day, you will have been exposed to 1.8 million words a year, and you'll be scoring at the 90th percentile or above. And this is similar to looking at, say, a sporting analogy. The more effort you put in, the more it pays off. But if you think about just your exposure to all these words gives you better ideas for story writing, gives you different ways of expressing yourself. As a high school student, you'll be encountering a whole range of language styles and genres and persuasive writing and things like that. Your spelling will be improving and increasing, your vocabulary will be increasing for both spoken and written work. So little graphics like this can be helpful for your kids. It's also really important that you seek a review, you have a checkup. If you look in the summary of your report, diagnostic report, you usually find that there's a time frame put in for a review. And at that time, adjustments are made, accommodations are changed, any new issues can be addressed before things get full-blown or complicated. Again, I have to say that one of the surprising things, a very simple thing that would make a difference that I see, is that people don't come back when things are going well. They think things aren't going too badly, it's fine. But then suddenly there's a change in circumstances, and they find that in actual fact their child has fallen behind 6, 9 months, 12 months in maths or something like that. And then they have to deal with both the academic and the emotional consequences of that, of the child feeling very distressed and depressed at the thought of not being on top of things, needing more work, feeling stupid and hopeless again. One of the things that I want to talk about is accommodations and adjustments for learning difficulties, and this is really important, and this is what's going to make a great deal of difference to your child's smooth day-to-day experience. So accommodations and adjustments should be available for day-to-day schoolwork if necessary, as well as NAPLAN competitions, scholarships, the HSC. Accommodations and adjustments are for classroom, assignment, homework, as well as exams. It's very important that you don't take an automatic no or a lack of awareness on the school's part as the final answer. I've been surprised at how often people will ask for something or ask if something's possible and be told, oh no, we don't do that here, or we can't do that, and that's not the case. Every school has the discretion to put in place reasonable accommodations that they believe will assist a student to be able to participate fully in the curriculum. So, following the principles of early intervention, we should be doing exactly what we think is appropriate for a child at the time it's seen to be needed, rather than wait till they're in high school or wait till their exams count for something. We want a child to experience success and the opportunity for their efforts to pay off and their results to improve and reflect their ability and their effort. It's also important to document everything. When you do come to the final stages of school and you're needing to make an application for formal provisions for something like the HSC, there's a section that requires you to document what's been done in the past, and so it's really important that you can even remember. I mean, you might not remember in a few years' time that a particular teacher did a certain thing which really made a difference. So in the senior years, so the last couple of years of school, the school has, again, the discretion to offer accommodations in line with what the Board of Studies is usually considering. So disability provision applications are open in term 4 of year 11, and they need to be lodged by the end of term 1 year 12 with current evidence. And at that time, it's also very important that you are able to produce the documentation to be able to say, my child's learning disability has been acknowledged and supported in this way over the last X years, and it has made this difference. It's really important that you have been communicating with their teachers in that time, because teachers will also be asked to provide a written statement of how do these learning difficulties affect the child's classroom and exam performance. And if your child's been working like crazy without anybody realising that they have a learning difficulty or a learning disability, then the teacher is going to say, oh, I didn't know, he's doing really well, and haven't had to do anything for him. But if you've been supporting them in a range of ways at home and not communicating that with the school has no way of being able to provide the type of information that the board is looking for. It's also really important that you understand that the tertiary system is extremely well informed about disability provisions and very supportive. It is absolutely commonplace and matter of fact there for a student to be able to request all sorts of provisions. Might be note-taking, so if a child's got an attentional difficulty and finds it hard to take good notes and listen to lectures, they may be able to be put on a list for notes to be emailed to them so that they can just listen. Exam accommodations are very flexible, additional time, use of voice to text, use of computers, a whole range of things. It's just matter of fact in the tertiary system. So if you're trying to think about what accommodation might be necessary, what adjustment might make a difference, this again is where your good comprehensive assessment will help you. The school or a person may have made a suggestion, a teacher might make a suggestion, well, we can do this. But there's not really a standard adjustment or accommodation for each child. You need to look at the child's strengths and weaknesses. So if, for example, a child has strong listening comprehension skills, then reading and speaking the instructions out aloud and having a reader and listening to books on tape and using text-to-speech programs are going to be of assistance. But if their listening comprehension is the same or lower than their reading comprehension, then a reader will not be helpful. It might be confusing and it might prove to your child that they're hopeless or dumb. Instead, what you would be looking at would be accommodations such as additional time in the classroom, pre-identification of difficult words, setting information in context, reviewing earlier parts of the story or the lesson, putting keywords up on the board, discussing what might come next, what would be an outcome, what would be a problem, providing a summary, use of storyboards, scaffolds. So it's quite different. So it's really important that you have that knowledge of what your child's particular strengths and weaknesses are. I can see that people are typing some information about lack of support and learning support. One of the issues that is always a problem at school is that sometimes people get stuck on whether a learning difficulty is funded or not. And parents will sometimes be told, oh, well, there's nothing we can do about dyslexia because there's no funds. That is not the case. There may not be funds set aside for dyslexia, but it is a recognised disability. And as I mentioned earlier, this is sometimes where you have to understand your rights and your child's rights, the disability standards as they relate to education. Your child deserves to have appropriate support and assistance in order for them to access the curriculum and learn. Oh dear, I'm sorry. This is the one slide I have tried multiple times to correct and didn't think it looked like that. So the research is showing us that factors that contribute to resilience include close relationships with family and friends, a positive view of yourself and confidence in your strengths and abilities, the ability to manage strong feelings and impulses, good problem solving and communication skills, feeling in control, seeking help and resources, seeing yourself as resilient rather than as a victim, and coping with stress in healthy ways and avoiding negative or harmful ways of coping. So therefore, what we need to do, and this, I know it just seems like a little bit of a list, but there isn't a lot of time. So the indicators are, you therefore need to teach your child a wide emotional vocabulary. Now, all of these things that I've written down here, I'm not necessarily saying that one person, a parent or a teacher, has to do, but these are the things you would gather your support team, you would use your contacts, your resources, and see if you can put in place. So developing a wide emotional vocabulary so a child just doesn't get stuck and say, I can't, it's too hard, I'm bored, whatever. So teach your child to tune into their thoughts as well as their feelings and be able to separate them. Teach your child a range of ways to regulate their emotions, and that includes teaching them ways of soothing and calming down, meditation, mindfulness, and I've included at the end a couple of apps that are quite helpful for that. Giving the child skills to problem solve, learning how to prioritise and evaluate information and approaches. Teach your child to think flexibly and have an open mind, and also how to let some things go. So part of that again is perspective taking. When we're thinking about learning and support staff developing recommendations and requesting accommodations, it's really helpful to have a thorough understanding of the condition or the difficulty that you're looking at. Think about the processes that are going to be involved and what's difficult and why. Think about what skills might need to be explicitly taught and what you would instead accommodate or modify. Think about how you support the strengths and the difficulties. Unfortunately, sometimes there's a real deficit focus when working with a child. So I can see that people seem to be writing some questions and answering each other, which is great. One of the questions that's popped up is, should you tell your child if they have a learning disability if they're not aware of it? Somebody said yes. I think most students are aware that they have difficulties with learning, and it is a good idea to discuss it in the most appropriate way for their age, and I will have a couple of slides coming up about that. So it's important to be neutral but explicit in the language and be very clear about what a child should or shouldn't do or should be expected to do at that stage. So one of the things to keep in mind is the frame of reference. So you need, as I said, to focus on strengths and interests and not just micromanage one aspect of a child's difficulty. Think about what you might need to teach. Do you need to teach decoding skills, or are you really looking at organisational and prioritising problems? What needs to be provided for this child to learn? This is a little graph of some possible adaptations and accommodations for writing, and this is in a very good book called Smart Kids with Learning Difficulties, Overcoming Obstacles and Realising Potential, and that's also in the handout at the end. Okay, these little graphs and charts are really helpful when we're talking with your child about their difficulties. They're also really helpful for teachers to understand what's going on. So this particular one has come from a site called TES Resources. These resources are free. You need to organise an account. And I must say that I find if I haven't used it for a little while, I have to create another one. But it's easy and it's free. So if we're thinking about dysgraphia, then you can see that straight away you're going to have some problems with organisation, with fine motor skills, concentration, and therefore there'll be some issues for classroom management. Activities and instructions might need to be broken down. You might need to think about how you're going to support and assist the handwriting issues. If you're talking with a child, you could look and say, some of these things are problems that you have, but actually you're pretty good at this. So, like everything else, that you have to sort of pick and choose what you take from the internet. Not every child with dysgraphia or dyslexia is going to have the exact same symptoms. The same as not every child with asthma is going to have the exact same symptoms or solutions. Another little tip sheet that's come from the Dyslexic Advantage website. Again, just at a glance, looks at the kind of things. So dysgraphia, and again, it's not exactly a disability of written expression, but it's included in that. So here they would say 1 in 5 students are dysgraphic. You will find a student will have fine motor issues, may also have dyslexia, may have language problems, attention issues, and difficulties with time awareness and time management. So some of the dysgraphia-friendly accommodations would be talking before writing, reducing the quantity of work, using a keyboard or a note taker, having alphabet strips and number lines for copying and modelling of the numbers and the letters in the early years, suggesting to the teacher not to overcorrect, and allow a range of different types of presentations, not just writing. Same kind of things for dyslexia. Again, you can find all of these fairly easily. The National Disability Coordination Office program has a wealth of information. This is one of the handouts that you can download, looking at some possible reasonable adjustments. So, for example, if you have a student who has difficulties with spelling or grammar, you might consider additional time, a scribe, an oral assessment by the examiner using an audio tape or a digital recorder, special equipment, special pens, things like that, Spellmasters model and practice examples to demonstrate what they have to do, worked examples, a whole range of things. So these are good starting points if you're looking to try and develop some accommodations and adjustments for your student. Okay, somebody's type, what type of specialist can make a diagnosis of dysgraphia? That would usually be either a paediatrician, an occupational therapist, or a psychologist would make that. Yes, there is a handout and information coming later. Okay, this is a little graphic for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Again, you can see it pulls out some of the key areas, organisational difficulties, attentional difficulties, even when motivated, tasks aren't completed, hyperactivity, concentration difficulties. These are not judgment or value laden, they're just straightforward, neutral language, matter of fact, and a good way of saying, well, actually that's a little bit like, you know, what you're like, and that's a little bit like Dad, and that's a little bit like me, and might be something here that we could change or do something about. Maths disorder, dyscalculia. There's a huge number of apps available for students with learning disabilities, and I know that I think there's a number of webinars that have been put out by this organisation. So it's relatively easy to find some good information for this. This again will be on your handout. Really helpful in terms of, say a child has organisational difficulties, there might be 3 or 4 different sorts of apps that you can get that would directly target that. Another form of looking at apps in the classroom, in the general classroom, if the child's having difficulty or even just promoting ways of analysing things. A little thing like Poplet is a great way of teaching these skills and keeping track of things. Okay, so in order to get more experience about how to provide these accommodations, how to write these accommodations and put them in place, lots of readings, workshops, seeking peer supervision with colleagues, or for a special purpose, going and meeting with a speech pathologist, inviting a speech pathologist to come in and speak to the learning support team, joining support groups, maybe even looking at some of the adult groups, join and monitor forums and discussion groups, a bit like Gifted Learning Disabled Australia or some of the teacher support learning groups, keeping abreast of position statements that are put out by the Australian Psychological Society or Macquarie Uni and other professional bodies. And Macquarie Uni has actually got some very helpful information. They have a section on their website, and I've listed this for you, called Music Briefings. And here they look at some of the very common interventions for learning difficulties, and they provide you just on a page with basic information. So as you can see here, you might be interested in the Tomatis method as a treatment for autism, or Fast for Word. So having a look at this one, this is CogMed, which is a very widely publicised and popular intervention for working memory. So here it gives you a statement of the problem, the rationale for why it might work, what the research says, and then a conclusion and a verdict. So for this, they have actually made a conclusion that there's not enough supportive research on this intervention at the moment that meets scientific standards that would justify their claims of effectiveness. More definitive conclusions should be reachable in the next few years with larger studies and more studies. So the verdict at the moment is not recommended, but in actual fact, it's sort of the verdict's half out. And that's a bit unusual for Macquarie, because normally they're very clear, yes or no. Behavioural optometry is another one, and they're very clear here, and will provide you with links and references. So that's worth looking at if you hear of a new intervention, or your school's asked to put something in place. Will CogMed be of assistance? Will Fast for Word be of good value? So I have made reference to there being a handout, and I think it's just being shown on the screen or coming up now. So this will come out to you with the link for the webinar when it's finished. I've just put a small number of books that are really helpful. There's also a link to Children's Hospital. For many years have been running an annual conference focusing on particular learning difficulties or medical difficulties and how they relate to education. And you can access all their papers and slides there. There's a particular one there that's helpful on reaching and teaching ADHD. That Smart Kids with Learning Difficulties is one of the books I mentioned to you. So that wheel of apps is in there. The Macquarie Uni briefings is there. I also did touch on the idea of using apps for mood and relaxation. There's a couple of good ones. There's Smiling Mind, which is a very good app to use for children of all ages. And there's actually a Canadian site, Anxiety BC, British Columbia. It's very, very good. And there's the disability standards if people want to look at that. There's some that have some links there that have some summaries that you'll find helpful. So I will just look and see if there's any questions. I know there's a lot that people seem to have been answered. Okay, thank you. Sorry, there's a lot of people have been typing and it's been hard to see what's down the bottom. There's some questions there about training and qualifying. I'm not sure about the places. The Australian Dyslexia Association, and trained myself how to help him. I don't know much about that. I do think you have to be cautious about organisations that accredit their own people and only feel that their own people can do things. Most professionals who are working in the educational and learning disability field will have a range of qualifications, from education to speech therapy to psychology, OT, physio, and will have usually worked across the discipline, will have worked in multidiscipline situations for a while, and have a great understanding of more than one issue. If you only understand dyslexia, you may be missing out on something else that's going on, something else that's happening neurological, something that's happening with attention, something that's happening with anxiety. Unfortunately, learning disabilities are often not straightforward, just a simple, it's one thing. Okay, so hopefully what you've got from tonight is that there is a lot that can be done to support the student, to educate yourself, to educate the student, and it's really important that you see this as being a positive way of supporting your child, one that will make a big difference to them, will help them to be able to advocate for themselves. It's important that a child can say, excuse me, can you keep that on the board a few minutes longer? I find it hard to listen and write at the same time and I've nearly finished. And that's a very polite, matter-of-fact way of advocating for themselves. Sorry, I can see someone's got a hand raised, but I don't know how to do anything about it.
How often should you have your child assessed?
How often should you have your child assessed? Okay. You should probably have your child reviewed at least 18 months to 2 years after the first assessment. Sometimes someone might say, look, I want to check something else in 6 months. For example, I would often want to check an attentional difficulty in 6 months, or check how the child has responded to the kinds of interventions. It would not necessarily mean I would do a 3 or 4 hour assessment again. There's not a need to reassess the whole big picture, usually every couple of years, but you do need to assess at points of change for the curriculum, going into high school, or at a time when a child perhaps needs more documentation to be able to access more support or more challenging curriculum. So that, again, it's not hard and fast. Somebody's saying review every 6 to 12 months. It could depend. Yes, it would depend. Okay. So, have we answered that, I think? Yes, the PowerPoint will go out. Yeah. Okay. Well, you should be able to re-listen to the webinar if you've got time. So, what assessment is done to diagnose dysgraphia? There's no single assessment. You would be looking at motor difficulties. I mean, dysgraphia is a little bit of a grab bag. You may be looking at a developmental coordination disorder. You would be looking at the child's executive functions, the child's motor functions, fine and gross motor functions. You would be looking at, you'd actually be looking at their social and emotional development as well. You'd be looking at their organisational skills for both written work and being organised around the home, friendship things, losing track of things. You would be having to take quite a detailed history, looking at their early development, their coordination in learning to ride a bike, swim, write, a whole range of things, as well as perhaps some tests of handwriting, looking at posture, looking at looking at a whole range. I mean, again, this is where often you might see a paediatrician and then be sent to an occupational therapist, or see an occupational therapist and be sent to somebody else. Okay. Somebody lost signal and missed the info on the PDF. It will come out to you as a link with the PowerPoint slides. Okay. I think that's probably it. Well, that's good. Thank you. How do we best push for support at school in K to 2 if a child is generally not keeping up, using avoidance techniques, hate doing homework, it's boring, it's too hard? I would talk to the school counsellor, ask if they could do an observation in class, get them to liaise with the school teacher, and then ask for a planning meeting with the school counsellor, the teacher, the stage head of stage or year coordinator, whatever. You may then need to be looking at an assessment, but perhaps there are some small things you can put in place first. It's worth hearing what the teacher and what the counsellor thinks. Do they think that your child is fine? Do they think that your child is distracted? Do they think that they're immature? Do they, I mean, whether you agree or not, it's important to hear what they think and perhaps test it out. So, I mean, if they think your child is distracted, what might be helpful? Would moving them to a quieter area be helpful? Would moving them to the front of the class be helpful? Would having a reminder, having an incentive chart, having a little thing that got ticked every, before break, after break, trying to find out if they're more distracted in the morning or the afternoon, investigate first and then look for an assessment. Have I found support for kids to be different in the public or the Catholic system? I think it varies. It really varies quite a lot how schools provide their support, but all schools do try and provide support. Again, there's no blanket rule, there's no things, but some schools will allocate their resources in the first couple of years, some will send it across right through to year 6 in learning support. Great. Public system's better for support. It's probably more formalised, but again, it really depends. It depends on the school. Did you say you would talk about how to talk to kids about their difficulties in age-appropriate language? I didn't say how I would. I said that would be what I would try to do. One of the ways is using things like the little graphics I showed you, or using something similar, and starting the conversation. It's like any complex situation, you'll have to come back to that. You'll have to talk a bit about things, see what they take on board, come back to them again later, ask them if they want to talk some more. Okay, I think we probably covered things. Okay. Sorry, I'll just go down to the bottom. Someone was typing. Okay, I think probably covered it. Okay, thank you everybody for sticking with us. So 62 people still here after an hour. That's great. Okay, thank you.